This week's reading invites us to reflect not on a virus, not on racism or issues of state-sanctioned brutality, but on yet another defining feature of our quarantine days: domestic tension. Of course, we haven't had any of that in my household, but I have heard that many others have. And it makes sense. We are with the members of our family more than we have ever been with them before. And we love them. Of course we love them. They are what we hold most precious in all the world. But somehow, at the same time, so help me, if you don't put that clean laundry that I folded for you into the closet by the end of today, I will set your room on fire. Again, that's just an example I am taking from my own imagination and has no correlating reality whatsoever in my household. The domestic dispute that we read about from Genesis is a fight about children. Remember the context. God had singled out Abraham of all the people in the ancient world, had called him to leave his home and to start a new family somewhere else, promising that he would make him into a great nation. And for whatever reason, Abraham obeyed. And then nothing happened. They couldn't even have one child. A great nation must have sounded like a cruel joke. And Sarah had so given up hope of ever bearing children herself that she suggests to Abraham eventually alternative means of producing an heir, her servant Hagar. And that works. Ishmael is born. But then, of course, we know what happens. Even though she laughed in the face of the idea, Sarah does become pregnant in her old age and gives birth to Isaac. That's the context. Here's the drama. What do you do when the child that your husband had with your servant, which was your idea in the first place, now threatens to supplant your son that you never planned on having as rightful heir and progenitor of a new nation? Something not all, but I would imagine most of us can relate to. Sarah pressures Abraham to banish Hagar and Ishmael to die in the wilderness, which he does, and then they almost do. Out of water, Hagar can't stand to watch her child die, so she casts him under a bush and walks away. But God hears the voice of the dying boy and saves them both. And not only that, God tells them that his promise to Abraham still includes Ishmael. A great nation will be made of him too. I see two mistakes that we might choose to learn from today in this story. They are the obvious ones. This is not a complicated sermon. But the first mistake is Sarah's decision to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. The other is Hagar's decision to cast the child under a bush. And even though these events themselves come out of a different world than ours, the emotions underneath their decisions translate into our own lives easily enough. How many of us have been in Sarah's shoes after years of determinedly clinging to hope for something, finally decided to give up hoping? And then over time, we felt despair harden into bitterness. Who among us hasn't used sarcasm and laughter to guard ourselves against earnest hope, because we know that hope means the possibility of getting hurt again? What parents among us haven't struggled daily to know how best to look out for and protect our own children? What parent among us hasn't occasionally gone too far in that endeavor? And then, instead of reversing course and asking for forgiveness, have decided to double down and say things like, well, I'm the parent here. How many of us, like Hagar, have been confronted with something tragic and recognizing that we can do nothing to fix it, have just walked away? But there is deeper explanations for the mistakes that Sarah and Hagar make. There's deeper descriptions than just emotional ones. These are theological mistakes. That is, they're decisions that are based on misunderstandings of God, of who God is and how God acts. So let's start with Sarah. Emotions to the side, Sarah's theological mistake is that she assumes the rich inheritance God promises to Abraham can only apply to one child. And one cannot really blame Sarah for making this assumption. This is just the way that inheritance worked in the ancient world. There was only so much to pass down, and the firstborn would always get the best portion. But first of all, she misunderstands the nature of God's promise. God's promise to Abraham and his lineage doesn't have so much to do with material well-being. It has to do with blessing. The destiny of Abraham's descendants were to be God's people, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, so that through them the world might be blessed as well. The world would look at Israel and see what the God of the universe was really like. And then the whole world would come to worship and be transformed by this God who created everything. Sarah's second misunderstanding is that the things that God gives do not exist in a zero-sum reality, and she assumes that they do. That is, Sarah assumes that this story is playing out in the worldly economy of scarcity, not the divine economy of abundance. God is not offering Abraham money or material possessions. God isn't even promising Abraham happiness. Actually, the rest of the Old Testament, while itself being a witness to the fulfillment of God's promise, is not at all a witness to Israel's happiness. God's blessings are of a different kind. God's blessings can make you holy. God's blessings are faith, grace, forgiveness, love, truth, mercy, and justice. And of those things, God has an infinite amount to give. In fact, the things that God gives multiply when they are received and passed on. That is Sarah's theological mistake. Hagar's theological mistake is more simple. She runs away from suffering rather than remain present to it, even if there's nothing she can do to fix it. The proof that these are theological mistakes is made clear when we hold these decisions up and set them beside the life of Jesus. Jesus is the abundant economy of God in action, multiplying five loaves into bread enough for thousands, healing blind, lame, and leprous, forgiving 70 times 7, never hoarding, always sharing, living a life dependent on the hospitality of others. And Jesus is God clearly and once for all, showing the world that his approach to the world's suffering is not to run away from it, but to enter into it himself, to experience our pain from the inside out. I know what you're thinking. We have ventured quite a long way from the territory of the domestic disputes of our quarantine existence. How is any of this helpful advice for navigating our very real life household tensions? Honestly, I don't know. I'm sure there's something, but that's actually not really what I wanted to talk about anyway. This was a bit of a bait and switch sermon. Because these theological mistakes have actually everything to do with all the conversations going on in our country right now. Conversations about racism. They have everything to do with how God is inviting us, calling us to navigate this uncharted territory of a pandemic. Because a fundamental assumption of our world, and particularly of this moment, is an assumption of scarcity, that there is not enough information available, not enough science, not enough wisdom, not enough trust, not enough money, not enough jobs, not enough resources, not enough good leaders. This can be a good moment for us to remember God's promise to Abraham is a destiny that we have been grafted into as the church. We are blessed to be a blessing in the things that we need most in the world, the things that we need for our lives to be ever more shaped into the image of Christ. None of those things have been taken away. God's forgiveness, grace, love, truth, mercy, kindness, and justice. Those things are on offer now as they always have been before. God's Spirit remains present with us now as God's Spirit always has been. And these are the things that we can and must share with the world, especially right now. This is not a moment for us to batten down the hatches and to make sure that only our nuclear families are being taken care of when the world is falling to pieces. What we have been given, we cannot and should not hold tightly. We cannot, like Sarah, operate out of a place of fear. We have been given great gifts, and this is a moment for us to live into God's economy of abundance. If you can remember back way to last fall when we were doing our annual stewardship campaign, I mentioned during our M&M meals that one of our priorities was to increase our budget for mission and outreach. And the vestry set forth the audacious goal of doubling that number this year from last year. And we didn't quite get there, but I was still proud of us. This year's budget shows a 50% increase of the money that we were going to give away off of our campus this year. That's nothing to bat an eye at. But then everything changed with this pandemic, and we realized that we needed to dig deeper, and we needed to give more money away, to adjust our budget so we could do so. And we invited you to give even more than you have before. And now, just a few weeks later, a few months into this crisis, not only have we doubled the money that we're giving away to local outreach organizations on the front lines, we've actually tripled it. And we're not stopping anytime soon. It's amazing to see our community respond with abundance in the face of a world that is only preaching scarcity. And that, of course, is just one example of what it looks like to be blessed, to be a blessing, so that the world can come to know this God. But this is not just a realize how lucky you are pep talk. That's why Hagar's mistake is also important for us to remember. We cannot stop at just giving money, which is something easy to do from a distance without being involved in the lives of others. We must still listen to the voices of those who are crying out in pain. This is as relevant to our conversations about racism as it is to how we respond to the virus. It's the reason to wear a mask, and it's the reason to read books and do self-study. These are both huge, massive problems, and the solutions to them are massive and complex and overwhelming for us to stand in front of. They are things that we cannot fix on our own, which is why it would be easy to just cast them under a bush and to look the other way and to carry on with our lives, with our safe families. But we as Christians have a responsibility to resist precisely that temptation. Even though we can't fix these big, massive, complex problems ourselves quickly, we can still choose to be present to the pain and suffering of others. And simply being present can start to change things in our own heart. And changing things in our own hearts is the first step towards changing things in the world. We have to pay attention. It is our responsibility, especially as a privileged congregation, especially as a mostly white congregation, especially as a congregation settled in a zip code in Austin that has one of the lowest infection rates of the virus. All the more that means that we cannot ignore the voices of those who are in pain. We have to remain present to those who are suffering. Even if all we can say is, we don't know what to do, but we are going to be here with you. Actually, that's probably a pretty good place to start with our domestic disputes, too. Amen.